So we have our next speaker, Dr. Ousman Kobo, and he will be addressing some of the questions that you have about Islam in Africa. He is an associate professor of history and is also currently serving as the chair or the director, excuse me, of the Center for African Studies at The Ohio State University. His research and teaching interests include 20th century West African social and religious history, contemporary Islamic history, Islamic mysticism, Islam and European colonialism in Africa, Muslim ecumenical leadership in post-independent West Africa, and the social history of West African migrants in the United States. You can see his and others' full bios on our website, but now I would like to turn it over to Dr. Kobo. Thank you. And Dr. Kobo, if you can unmute.
I'm very sorry. Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. And thank you, Professor Ngom, really for setting the stage. What I want to do is to spend the first I have only 20 minutes to do what I do for an entire semester. And I'll try to commit myself to the time. But I want to go very, very to the basic, right? I want to, so why is this thing not moving? So I would like to go to the basic. Just in case any of us is not familiar with that foundational history of Islam, then we come to Islam in Africa. Of course, Prophet Muhammad was born in 570 of the Common Era and died in 632 CE. He lived for just about 60-something years. But during these 60-something years, he changed the religious and cultural landscape, or rather, he initiated the change of the cultural, religious, and political landscape of the entire world. For Prophet Muhammad, what did he do? He preached monotheism, and monotheism here is similar to Judaism and Christianity. So Muslims do see their religion as the third and final revelation of God. So Islam being one of a continuity of Judaism, then Christianity, and then Islam. So Muslims believe, of course, in all the revealed texts, which are all mentioned in the Quran. The Quran has several verses which emphasizes that Islam is just a continuity of what God had initiated, beginning with Judaism. So Prophet Muhammad, with all the persecution of his folks, as Professor Ngom mentioned just now, decided to leave Mecca, where he was born, to Medina, Yathrib then, but Medina, in 622 CE. Now, 622 CE is very important because it is the beginning, it marks the beginning of the Muslim calendar. So the argument is often made that that hijrah is the beginning. But we also know that the first hijrah, as Brenda's question was very important, and I'm glad that I have this. I didn't assume that all of us have the answer. And her question is very good, and Professor Ngom already gave the answer. But that first hijrah was when Prophet Muhammad instructed his followers under the leadership of Uthman bin Affan, who would become the third caliph of Islam, to take these folks to the pious, just Christian king of Aksum. Aksum in northern Ethiopia, we want to make it simple. So that entire area has moved back and forth in terms of kingdoms, right? But today, Aksum is located in Eritrea, just between Eritrea and Ethiopia. You can see it in the map here. So it is dated 613 or 615 of the Common Era. For us Africans then, and Professor Ngom is right, Islam was planted in Africa before its diffusion anywhere else. In fact, I provoke my other Arab Muslim friends by telling them that, by the way, the very first mosque for Muslims was built in Aksum by these refugees. Of course, we know that the Kaaba was in Mecca, but Prophet Muhammad, because of the massive persecution, did not build a mosque while he was in Mecca. He had to build one when he moved to Medina, but his folks built one around 615, 616 in Aksum. So when we say a Muslim, what makes anyone a Muslim? This is also just a basic knowledge. So we often talk about the 5 pillars of Islam. The very first of the 5 pillars is to express one's faith by agreeing that there is just one God worthy of worship, and that one singular God cannot be associated with anything else. That God is unique, the God of creator, the God who created everything. So that is the first thing a Muslim had to do. But a Muslim also had to agree and profess that Prophet Muhammad was also the prophet and messenger of God, and the final messenger of the monotheistic faiths. A Muslim also has to pray 5 times a day, give alms when charity to the poor. A Muslim would also fast 30 days or 29 days in the month of Ramadan and perform the pilgrimage if they can afford it. And we can see the first 2 are part of a belief system. The others are a little bit more flexible. If you're poor, you become the recipient of charity, not the giver of charity. If you are sick, you cannot fast. The Quran has given instruction on what to do when you cannot fast. One does not have to fast when they're sick. Pilgrimage is also when one could afford it. If you cannot afford to perform pilgrimage, that is definitely understandable by God, the Creator, according to the belief of Muslims. Islam also has 2 fundamental sources of laws and practices, as most of you or all of you already know. The Quran and the Sunnah. The Quran, of course, Muslims believe, was revealed to Prophet Muhammad by Angel Gabriel incrementally. Muslims also believe that the Quran is the final revelation of God, which confirms the Torah, the Psalms of David, Zabura, the Gospel of Christ. So the Quran is part of this larger continuity of the monotheistic faiths. The other important aspect of Muslims' laws and practice is Sunnah or Hadith, that is the sayings and practices attributed to Prophet Muhammad, which are intended to elaborate on the laws and stuff that are mentioned in the Quran. Now let's go to a little bit of the expansion of Islam, and I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but I have this here just for the dates, and we'll come to Africa. Now, Islam began to expand into Africa almost around the same time that it was expanding to other parts of the world. Muslim Arab conquerors reached from Egypt and continued all the way down to Spain, where Muslims established kingdoms. So you can see where the arrows is moving. You can also see the date from 641 in Egypt, Alexandria, 643, all the way by 712, the Muslim armies have conquered southern Spain. What is relevant for us here is the northern part of Africa where Islam would be planted. So with this implantation of Islam, then, we can now make a transition to Islam in Africa. And I like to show this map because it shows the roughly the demography of Islam and predominantly Christian South. So Islam, of course, extending all the way from the north into modern West Africa, you can see, and then also along the coastal part of East Africa. When I teach history of Islam, I like to describe this as culture zones. So one culture zone being the Red Sea, where people in Africa and across the Red Sea shared to some extent some cultural affinities. So Islam traversed those areas. The Mediterranean is also another culture zone, and one could see this below the Sahara, how Islam expanded all the way to West Africa. These maps are not entirely accurate, but they are illustrative. So then now let me also go very quickly on how Islam spread throughout Africa. And for the purpose of convenience, we use chronology, but chronology is not respective of physical boundaries. Chronology do not represent physical boundaries. So I use this illustrative phases just to show how Islam spread. We can argue that the very first phase, starting roughly from about 800 of the Common Era, the Muslim expansion into North Africa had a profound effect on the implantation of Islam, not necessarily its expansion, but the planting of the seed of Islam. In phase 2, which is around 11th century CE, and we can go back to the 10th century, Muslim African merchants in their relationship with their Berber Muslims began to convert. And Professor Ngom has mentioned this. I don't want to go into all the details, but you can see all those dots are, of course, what we describe. I mean, that's the slide in the middle is what we describe as trans-Saharan trade routes. And it's through these trans-Saharan trade routes that African merchants in their relationship with their Berber co-business people embraced Islam. And when they embraced Islam, it was not forced on them. They embraced Islam of their trading partners for a number of reasons, including, of course, faith, but it also includes the pragmatism of having a language and a common conception of rules of commercial engagement. Now, from this second phase then, many of the ruling elites also embraced Islam. And one of these ruling rulers, emperors, is, of course, Mansa Musa, whom most of you here have probably heard about and have read about, and I'm not going to go into too much of the details. Phase 4 is particularly interesting because that was a time when we see the expansion of Islamic knowledge in the West African region. That's also the case on the East African coast, by the way. And during this time, with the expansion of scholarship, many Muslim scholars embraced the Sufi, became Sufi leaders, and began also to engage in active conversion. Many of these are part of trading canvas, especially traders who come all the way to further south to what is today Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. And these scholars became preachers. They travel with the traders, and when they reach a place, whether they establish themselves or they encounter people, they gradually began to preach the faith. So Islam spread definitely through trade, but it also spread through the engagement and activities of its missionaries, mostly the Sufi brotherhoods. But I make this provocative argument too, that Islam grew in Africa much faster during the colonial period and during the post-independent era than it did in the era before European colonial rule. Here we're talking about figures. Why and how did this happen? Well, colonial rule was itself fragile. Even though we have the tendency of seeing Europeans as having power, but wherever one looks at, European colonizers had to find ways to work with indigenous elites, indigenous rulers, in order for colonial rule to be firmly established. In the case of many parts of Africa, especially in West Africa, European colonial leaders established strong relationship, alliances with African religious Muslim leaders. And and in doing so, actually allowed, encouraged, and facilitated the spread of Islam, because now many of the elite who have become somehow who have accepted colonialism focused almost exclusively on the expansion of their faith. European colonizers also discouraged missionaries from evangelizing in Muslim communities. This is the case with northern Nigeria, in part of Senegal, and many places. Why? Because they saw missionaries as potential troublemakers. If missionaries were to go into Muslim areas and try to propagate their faith, there was going to be a problem. And European colonizers did not want to deal with these problems. So they told the missionaries, please stay away from those areas. Pragmatism, not the love of the faith, but being practical. The colonial economy was also important in this regard because the colonial economy expanded and Europeans built roads, and these roads facilitated the movement of people. Immigrants, Muslim migrants who settled in non-Muslim communities began to encourage or preach their faith, or the indigenous folks see the religion of the migrants as being practical, and they love it, and then they convert. In many places, that's how Islam expanded. If you are with me now, I want to make a transition very quickly to issues that I've mentioned earlier. We've talked about Sufism and Sufi brotherhoods. What are Sufism and Sufi brotherhoods? Well, Sufism is the mystical aspect of Islam. Sufis are people who believe that in addition to the standardized normative laws, there are also spiritual aspects of Islam that when one embarks on, that person would have a closer proximity to the divine. So they believe in mysticism, they practice mysticism, but they are, of course, one has to emphasize, very, very pious Muslim. The foundation of being a Sufi is piety. That's the most important foundation. There are a large number of Sufi brotherhoods, but for the sake or for the purpose of Africa, the Qadiriya brotherhood, by the way, Sufism did not begin in Africa. Sufism was an integral part of the expansion of Islam. In fact, to make things easier, we normally trace the development of Sufism to Baghdad in today's Iraq, which was the capital of the Abbasid Muslim Caliphate from about 800 CE. Sufism began to develop there, and we don't have the time to go into the details, transformed itself into brotherhood from simple individual belief and personal mysticism to group belief under a leadership. The oldest of this in Africa, and indeed most part of the world, is the Qadiriya Sufi brotherhood, which is named after Abdul Qadir al-Jilani. The other one for Africa is Tijaniya, which is very widespread. If you have students from West Africa in your class and they are Muslims, quite likely that they would be, their parents or their grandparents would have been affiliated with either the Tijaniya or the Muridiya. The Muridiya is centered in Senegal, but the Tijaniya is across the entire African continent. We also have other Muslim groups, the Salafi groups, sometimes we confuse them with Wahhabis. The Salafis are the opponents of the Sufi brotherhoods. The Salafis believe that Sufism is unaccepted in Islam. It's an innovation that came into Islam from the Christian world, and therefore Sufis are not authentic Muslims. But when one goes back to look at the 5 pillars of Islam, what makes one a Muslim is already established by the 5 pillars. But Salafis have a very strong doctrine about tracing all Islamic practices, all Islamic beliefs to the time of the Prophet Muhammad and the generations that came after him. Anything beyond that is seen as an innovation. So there's almost always, since probably the 19th, 20th century, in Africa, tension between the Salafis and the members of the Sufi brotherhoods. I just want us to look at this figure here very quickly. to have an idea of the demographic distribution of Islam, of Muslim populations. Sub-Saharan Muslims are huge. I often joke with my friends that when one puts African countries, the population of African Muslims together, they far exceed the population of Muslims in the Middle East or the Near East. In fact, the population of Muslims in Nigeria alone is more than many Muslim, quote unquote, Muslim countries. So when we look at this, sub-Saharan African Muslims, 1990, almost 140 million. Look at 2010 and the projection in 2030. East Africa, when you look at this, you can see that there are more Muslims in West Africa than in any other region. So for the most part, that explains why scholars tend to make more reference to West Africa than they do to other parts of the region, even though the dynamics of Islam in West Africa and East Africa are quite similar in terms of the propagation of the faith. Southern Africa is unique in its way because Southern Africa, and we can see how small the population of Muslims is, the very first group of Muslims to South Africa were political convicts of the Dutch from Indonesia who settled the people they call their political refugees in South Africa, and therefore established the foundation for Islam in that Southern African region. But there was also a huge migration of people from the Indian subcontinent also to Southern Africa. And we can see, so the bottom one here is also a further projection, and it shows the population of Muslims in sub-Saharan Africa being almost 28.3% of Muslims in the entire world. And to close, I thought that I might also add just a couple of nomenclature nuances. So what is the difference between Islam and Muslims? And sometimes in our classes, we need to be a little bit careful. So Islam is the name of the religion, and Muslims are those who practice Islam. Christianity, Islam. Christians, Muslims. I believe you get me on that, for just in case. I also encourage myself to always avoid describing Muslims as Muslim people. I think it's enough to say Muslims, and it's or to say Arab people instead of Arabs, African people instead of Africans. The Muslim religion, I always say, it's not a bad thing, but why don't we just say Islam, right, instead of Muslim religion? In the case of Africa, these days, we try to avoid using the word tribe to describe Africans. So instead of African tribes or African natives or natives of Africans, please, let's just say Africans. Or, if we want to elaborate, African ethnic groups. And this is where I would like to stop. I hope I did not exceed my 20 minutes, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kobo. I'd now like to turn it over to my colleague, Brenda Randolph from Howard University, who will share some resources for you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the wonderful discussion and for the questions. This is going to be very brief. We need to see the PowerPoint. And I'm just going to mention a couple of resources that provide some information on Islam. So at Howard University, we started this magazine, an online magazine for teachers and students, which we call Book 2, which is named for the legendary founder of Timbuktu. And in the first issue, there is information on trade and scholarship in medieval West Africa, and we focus particularly on the master-disciple method of instruction in Islamic West Africa, and on the family of Ousman Khan, who teaches at Harvard University. So you will learn all about his family and about his mother, his grandfather, his great-grandfather, who were great scholars in Islam. We also have a student corner in Book 2, and we have information on Timbuktu, the Muslim city of scholars. And next slide, this is our first edition, and our second edition of Book 2 is Understanding Ajami, and it's an interview with Dr. Falun Gong, who we just heard from. And in addition to information that he provides on Ajami, a lot of what you heard earlier today, we have in the student corner, we have asked, what is Ajami, where is it used, and how can I write with this, which was done by Elsevier, and you'll see some activities for students.